It's a cool and rainy October morning, and I'm here filming for you because this is the perfect kind of weather to get us all thinking about the things that we need to do in our gardens over the next few months to make sure that they're tucked in well for the winter, that they do well during the winter, and possibly to get a jump on some things that you might want to be doing come spring. Before we get into that, I just want to make sure you're aware that I'm going to have a few bonuses for you toward the end of the video, so be sure and stick around for those. I'm Kara, and this is Home and Garden DIY, where you'll get the information you need so you can get started on the projects that you want to work on. One task that you might want to add to your fall and winter gardening list is collecting leaves for your compost pile. While I'm already talking about leaves, I want to mention that you can use leaves as cold protection for your plants. When it's windy, a lot of times leaves will collect around the bases of your plants, and what you'll need to do throughout the fall and the winter is have a check periodically, once every couple of weeks or so, around the bases of your plants. If the leaves that are collected there are largely dry and crisp, and I use the word fluffy to describe them usually, and these are some of those dry fluffy leaves that I'm talking about. If they are just collecting there and they're not wet and compacted around the base of your plants, that's fine, and they're giving your plants nice winter protection. But something that you really do have to watch for is if there were already leaves or other dead plant matter in underneath there that you never had opportunity to clean out earlier in the year, and that matter is still in there at the base of your plant, and there are other leaves collecting around it, you can get a situation where that will start to rot at the base of your plant, and you certainly don't want that. So you want to watch for the difference between those dry, fluffy leaves that actually provide good insulation and leaves that are actually broken down, that are wet and slimy and black and look more rotted. If those are collecting at the base of your plant, you need to reach in there, pull those away, and in most cases, if it was my garden, I would just go ahead and pull those out and throw that stuff in the compost pile, because again, you're potentially encouraging rot if you leave those there. Another thing you of course want to consider and work with as you are working with your garden over the fall and winter is cleaning up plants that may have died back because of the cold weather or just because they're done at the end of the season. And those plants of course are annuals. Common annuals will be plants like petunias, marigolds, zinnias, and other plants that are just going to bloom for one season for you and then will die when they're hit with frost or freeze. So for your annuals that are in your landscape, once we've had a frost or a freeze, or they've simply just lived their lives out and they're not looking good anymore, you can either just go ahead and pull that plant out of your landscape, or what I prefer to do is just cut it off right at the ground level and just leave those roots in the soil. Now, one thing that what I would suggest to you to do is when you're cutting that off, whatever blooms, dead blooms are still there on that plant, I suggest to you to take them and just kind of rub them between your fingers and just drop them there in the same place where you just had them. Because if you'd like that plant to come back again next year, if you leave those seeds right there in the spot where they were currently growing this season, you have a higher chance that they might come back for you the next season without you doing anything or having to buy new plants. Now, for those of you who may not know, some plants will not come back from seed, or they'll come back as not the same plant that you had initially. Now, I've had annuals whenever I've taken them and, rubbed them in my fingers like that and dropped them in the same place. I've had zinnias come back that were brightly colored the first season I planted them, and they might come back very, very pale in color, or they'll come back just white. Just to quickly give you a little bit more information about the topic that I just mentioned, this is with regard to whether or not a seed is a hybrid or it is open pollinated. And the slides that you're looking at right now are from two different sites that I recommend, where you can learn more information about both of those types of seeds, and I have linked them down in the description for you, so go ahead and check those out. I also want to say as a disclaimer that because both of these sites have all sorts of different writers, you may find information that does not pertain to organic gardening. And if you do, I just want to state clearly that I am a 100% organic gardener, and I do not recommend synthetic chemicals of any kind for lawn, garden, or really home either. But specifically for purposes of this video, not for lawn or garden. So please be aware that as you look at these sites, if you find things that are talking about something where you should use Roundup, or you should use Miracle Grow or Scott's Weed and Feed or something like that, I do not recommend that. So you can check out some of my other videos about organic amendments that I do recommend. So I hope the information about the hybrids and open pollinated seeds is helpful to you. And if you have any questions about it, just go ahead and leave those in the comments. With regard to perennials, most of your perennials that are going to remain evergreen throughout the winter, you're not going to have to do a whole lot to those, except perhaps to cut back dead blooms that are on them, cut back dead bloom stalks. Sometimes plants like chrysanthemums or mums will get hit by freeze on the outside edge of the plant, and they could stand a little bit of trimming, but you don't have to cut the plant all the way down. I'm just not a big fan of cutting plants all the way off in the winter, cutting them back hard. So that's not something I'm going to recommend to you to do. Now, with perennials that do die completely back above ground when they get hit by frost or freeze, you are going to need to remove that dead plant matter that's, above ground, whatever that green foliage was that died back. You will need to cut that back at some point. I don't suggest that you have to run right out to the garden and cut that back the next day after we've had a frost or a freeze, but it is something that you need to keep an eye on, because if it is a large plant like a lantana, for example, and I have one in our front yard that can get to be almost 8 feet across. So if you have a plant that's that large and there's a lot of dead matter sitting there above the root, you can potentially get a situation where there is rot being encouraged right down at the base of the plant, and of course you don't want that in your garden. So it's as simple as going out there the next time that you see you got a halfway decent day and you have time to do it, just go ahead and go out there and cut away that dead plant matter. And I would suggest to you, that you leave, some amount there in your landscape that remains from the base of the plant, even though it's dead, so that you know where that plant still is in your landscape. It's very easy for me when I'm out in my garden to forget that I have a plant in a specific spot if that top portion of the plant has died back. So I generally will leave some of that bottom portion there so that I can remember that I've got a plant there in my landscape. And so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This is a Mexican petunia that we have in a pot, and this is what it looks like before the freeze that is expected. It's a perennial, but it actually, all of this green foliage dies back completely at our first frost or freeze. So I just wanted to show you what it looks like before it gets hit by a freeze. And then we have a freeze expected. So I'm gonna show you what this looks like after it's been hit by a freeze so that you know what to look for on your plants. Okay, here's a follow-up on this plant. This has been hit by freeze, and you can see what happens to it. It just really gets dark and the foliage is droopy and just really hit hard by the freeze that we had. So let me just show you this a little better. So if this is left to just rot and sit, and you had a lot of plant that was just really hit by frost and it just was sitting there in your landscape, this stuff would start to rot and could potentially cause rot down around the base of your plant. So that's one reason to come in and cut away some of this dead matter. Now, like I said, I would go ahead and leave some of these stems, just these blank stems, so that I remember, okay, that's the spot that that plant holds in my landscape. So that's a follow-up for you, so you can see, what that looks like after it gets hit with freeze. The final class of blooming and ornamental plants that I want to mention to you is, of course, roses. Now, roses, as a general rule, you should not be cutting on your roses until it's almost time for them to start putting on new bud eyes, start producing new branches and new leaves, and for them to begin the process of starting to put on blooms in the spring. Now, there are exceptions to that. Here in north central Texas, you can go ahead and cut away anything that's dead. You can do a small amount of shaping, but here and in other climates that don't get as cold as, say, Ohio or Montana or somewhere like that, we could get some warm weather in the winter time, and if we do, you got to think that your rose may potentially start to put on some growth. So you don't want to be doing that hard pruning when the rose potentially is in a dormant season. So here I would recommend that if you're going to do any more pruning to shape your rose, that you just wait until closer to spring. Now, as I just mentioned, in colder climates, when that rose is going to go completely dormant in the winter, you can certainly do pruning that shapes it for whatever form that you're looking for your rose, and do that pruning in the winter. But again, that's going to be in significantly colder climates than here in north central Texas. Another matter that you're going to need to keep in mind as you go through the late fall and through winter is that your plants, especially your perennials, your trees, continue to receive enough water during that season. Now, of course, they're not going to need nearly as much water as you would give to your landscape during the summer, but you do need to keep track of whether there has been any rain, and if a week has gone by without rain, you might need to go out and just have a walk through your garden and see how the plants are doing and if they look as though they need some supplemental water. Now, if you have evergreen trees in your landscape or very large shrubs that are evergreen, one thing that you do need to keep in mind is that those trees and large shrubs are also going to be requiring more water. And if you're not adding supplemental water to your landscape in the winter, those trees, just by virtue of the fact that they're so much larger than the other plants in your landscape, they're going to be reaching out through those feeder roots around them to capture moisture, and it'll actually take it away from your smaller plants, from your shrubs and from your perennials. So being out in your yard, being out in your garden, and observing your plants year-round is the best way for you to be able to come to know what your landscape actually needs, what your plants need, if they need to be fed, if they need to be watered. That's the best thing that you can do. The other watering situation that I want to discuss with you is when you're getting ready to have a frost or a freeze event. In that case, the best thing you can do is make sure that your landscape is well watered prior to that happening. By making sure that you've watered ahead of that frost or freeze event, you are protecting the roots of your plants because you've caused them to be well hydrated, and they're not going to run such a great risk of freezing when they get hit by that really cold weather. So if you have a sprinkler system that you could run on low, if you have soaker hoses, if you have the desire to go out and just take a hose sprayer and water right at the ground, I do that sometimes, so that may sound a little crazy, but if I have a plant I'm especially concerned about, I'll go and just water right at the ground with my hose end sprayer. So you can do any of those things. You can even take a sprinkler and just run it on a really low setting. And so if you just, it's very important for you to keep track of what the weather is and whether you have a frost or a freeze event coming up, so that you can get ahead of that and get out there and get the ground around your plants watered so that they come through that event well and the roots not freezing. Something I want to be sure and share with you that a lot of my clients haven't known when I've shared this with them, but fall and during the winter are terrific times to plant shrubs and trees. Here in north central Texas, of course, we get these crazy hot summers, and when you plant a plant in the fall or in the winter, you give that plant time to get established when it's not having to do it in the middle of 110 degree weather or 100 degree weather. So that's a huge thing. So if you're thinking to put a tree into your landscape, I would strongly suggest that you do that in the fall or in the winter so that it has time to get established when it's not so hot. Another good task to have on your list for fall and winter is pruning your trees. Cut out anything that's dead. If you're trying to prune for a certain shape, you can go ahead and do that at that time. It's also a good time to cut back large shrubs and do any pruning that may need to be done on those. I mentioned earlier that I'd have a couple of bonuses for you, and one of those is that it is a great thing to order plants by mail when you're ordering trees and shrubs, because so many mail order companies will not ship plants in the summer just because of the risk that is run for them to ship them and perhaps have them sit at your front porch because you're at work, and the plants suffer because of that, and you have a plant that's not as good as it could have been if they had shipped it at a more optimal time of the year. So very late summer and fall and winter generally are very good times to buy those foundation plants and be able to get them shipped to you at the time that you want them shipped, so that you can put them in the ground during the time that's best for the plant. Now, one thing that I'm often asked about is when you should either apply mulch or reapply mulch to your landscape and around your plants. And because of what I mentioned earlier about the fact that that organic matter that you put around your plants can sometimes get up around the base and create a situation where it's actually encouraging rot, I don't generally recommend that you apply mulch going into the late fall and into winter for that reason. The exception would be if you're putting in very small plants that need to get established during that time. In those instances, a layer of mulch can be a very good thing. So I want to offer to you at this point that if you are considering doing something like that in your landscape this year and you have questions about it, definitely put that in the comments and I will get back to you and get you the information that you need so that you know how to proceed and whether you should apply mulch or not. So with regard to mulch, what I recommend that you do is, as we get closer to spring and the days are starting to warm up and we're getting nighttime temperatures that are closer to 50, I suggest that you just catch some nice days where we're going to have, a mid 50 or mid 60 degree day, and get out then and do your mulching around your plants. And just one thing I want to touch on while we're talking about mulch. If you're in a really hot climate, and especially if your plants are still small, mulch needs to go on in a layer that's about 3 inches thick. So sometimes you'll see people just spread it thinly to get as much coverage as they can, and really that's not helping you very much. A couple of inches, at least 2 inches, is really the bottom line of where you want to go in terms of applying a nice thick layer of mulch. Another good task to have on your list for fall and winter is, if you have plans to create a new bed, whether it's for veggies or for ornamentals in your landscape, that's a great time of the year to do it. One more bonus that I want to be sure you're aware of is that in climates like we're in here in Texas, sometimes we get really iffy weather in the spring, and we will see our ornamental trees start to bud out. Daffodils and other spring bulbs will start to come on. The red buds will start to bloom. Everything will think, okay, it's spring, it's time to warm up. And then sometimes we'll get a jolt of weather that's in the mid to low 30s, and of course those buds are going to get literally nipped in the bud and they will freeze. So if you happen to have in your landscape plants like lilies or daffodils or something that you really want to see bloom that spring, and you know that some of that cold weather is coming, you can go out in the yard and just cover those up. And you'll need to make sure that you come back the next day if it warms up, and take whatever that covering is off of that plant. But I've used things like trash cans, plastic bins and containers when we had smaller recycle bins that were the size of a laundry basket. I just put that upside down, put a brick on top of it. You can use whatever is handy to cover up that plant, and that way, you know, if you have tons of those in your yard, you may not want to cover up everything. But if you, especially if you're a newer gardener, or you've just added some bulbs to your landscape and you really want to see them this spring, that's a way that you can make sure that those buds don't get nipped when they're tender and you miss that bloom for that year. In just a minute, I'm going to have the usual flowers and music for you to enjoy, but just before doing that, I want to invite you again that if you have any questions, be sure and put those in the comments, regardless of where you are in the country. You don't have to be here in Texas for me to be able to help you. I've lived in Oklahoma for a number of years, and I'm originally from Ohio, so I know what it's like to have a really cold winter. So I'll be happy to help you wherever you are. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you next time.